This week, Steve Springett, chair of Cyclone DX SBOM Standard Core Working Group, for a discussion on the rise of SBOM. Next up, Carlos Morales, the CTO, Security Services at Neustar, joins us for a discussion on how applications are your lifeblood, understanding the changing attack. In the enterprise security news, Code 42 enhances Insider to help insider risk related to file uploads. Imperva acquires Cloud Vectra to provide visibility and security for API traffic. Threat Quotient launches ThreatQ TDR Orchestrator, which is coming out soon. KnowBe4 launches artificial intelligence-driven phishing features, and some more funding and acquisition updates from Tomo Bravo, Proofpoint, Darktrace, JupiterOne, and more. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
Hey IT and security pros, if you remember one thing from today's episode, it should be to check out the leading cloud directory platform, JumpCloud. JumpCloud's directory platform makes it easier to solve today's IT challenges by unifying device and user management through a single pane of glass. With JumpCloud securely managing your users and their devices, doing common things like onboarding and offboarding remote workers is easy. Try JumpCloud for free today at securityweekly.com/JumpCloud and help your organization move to a modern, secure hybrid work model. Wide-scale adoption of cloud applications, an increase in remote workers, and expansion of branch offices has rendered the centralized, on-premises security model impractical. Enter Cisco Umbrella. Umbrella now includes secure web gateway, firewall, and cloud access security broker functionality, plus integration with Cisco SD-WAN, all delivered from a single cloud security service. It helps businesses of all sizes secure their network and extend protection to roaming users and branch offices. Security doesn't have to be complicated. Get simple, smart, and powerful security with Cisco Umbrella. Visit securityweekly.com/Cisco Umbrella to learn more. We're proud to announce Cso Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. Cso Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. Cso Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP. Well, welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly, episode number 226 for May 5th, 2021. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Adrian Sanabria. Adrian, welcome.
Hey, happy to be back this week.
Mr. Tyler Shields is here with us as well. Welcome, Tyler.
Yeah, man. Welcome back. Welcome back to full-time production from your vacation. So great to see you.
That's right. Good to see you as well. Look comfy on the couch.
Yeah, I'm taking a little bit easy, relaxed day today.
Very nice. Very nice. Let's see, quick announcement. Our next technical training will be tomorrow, May 6th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, exploring common misconfigurations of Nginx, the damage they could do, and how to avoid them. Then we will see how attackers gain access to endpoints and learn defensive strategies to protect against those attacks in our May 13th technical training. You can go to securityweekly.com/webcasts and register today. If you miss any of them, you can go to securityweekly.com/on-demand. Joining us today, Steve Springett, the chair at Cyclone DX SBOM Standard and Core Working Group, is here to talk about the rise of SBOM. Sounds like a Marvel movie. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
I love it's good for you to have you here, Steve. I love your setup. It looks like you got the nice microphone and camera going on. I think you might win an award for our guest with the nicest microphone and camera.
We have way too much time with COVID.
Yes, exactly. It's very true. It's very true. Steve, how did you get your start in security and get to working on SBOM-related activities?
That's a great question. So I actually started in physical security back in the early 90s. So I was doing access control for high-rises and banks here in the city of Chicago. And I finally got into early internet stuff and right around the year 2000 or whatnot, we started doing a little bit of security work, but it wasn't full time until roughly around 2008. And around that time, I started doing supply chain stuff actually for pharmaceuticals. So tracking the pharmaceuticals, how it was manufactured and how it was distributed and wholesaled and to the shelves of your local pharmacy. So that got me into the supply chain. But around 2008 or so, I got into software security.
Nice. 1990 in Chicago is in one of that particular location and time frame is a reference in a book that I'm reading. There was I think it was Foley was his name, was an investigator that was part of Operation Sun Devil. They were taking down, teenage hackers in the 90s.
Were the days.
Yes, very different from today is what I get from a lot of my research. It's interesting the progression when we think about specifically SBOM, how sophisticated we have become in security, how much more sophisticated the attackers are, where there's a whole movement around just the bill of materials about what's in your software.
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of different folks are coming to that same realization, and I think it's one of these things where breach fatigue, right? It's what component today has been popped, and what organizations are going to be impacted by that. It's,
right. I think yesterday, today it was Exim.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
you lose track after a while.
Yeah. It's interesting. So there was 21 vulnerabilities in Exim, and related to this topic, I was like, man, that's got to be embedded in a whole bunch of stuff, right? Exim is likely under the covers in so many different MTAs across the internet. I think it's 68 million, and something like 60% of all of the MTAs out there today are running Exim.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. For sure.
In knowing that as a customer is interesting, kind of using that as an example. It was kind of where my brain was going was, do I know that I have Exim? And do I know that I need to patch or contact my vendor and go, hey, the MTA running on this thing, virtual or physical, right? The software is somewhere on there. Is it on there, and do I need to worry about it?
Yeah, it's a really common question you get from customers or partners or whatever. If you are a software company, and I've spent most of my life working for software companies, that's a common thing. You sell a piece of enterprise software, whatever it is, and obviously that includes other stuff that you build on top of as reusable components. But customers call in all the time. Hey, am I impacted? And it usually leads to every single development team kind of doing some research. So SBOM is one way that we can kind of minimize, I think, that kind of impact just by providing a little bit of transparency.
Yeah, I think just knowing in this, because it's not even enterprise software can be delivered obviously as a SaaS service today. And I bet you there are SaaS providers that have things like Exim somewhere in their, services and service mesh. And now if they don't have a bill of materials already, you have to go back and do that work, and that takes time. And time is of the essence right now.
Yeah. Ideally, you want to create SBOMs as part of as part of the process that you're building software. And it's interesting how different folks come to the SBOM road, I guess. Some come from the transparency perspective. Hey, we need to know what's in our stuff. I actually came from the opposite perspective. I was building some software for some OWASP projects that I was involved with, and I needed to decouple what SCA tools, software composition and analysis tools, typically do, where they identify the components and the licenses and everything else about it. I needed to decouple that what it is from the actual tool. And that's kind of how I arrived at the whole SBOM thing. And it's interesting because if you go through it from the aspect of just good engineering, it kind of leads to eventual transparency.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting use case because, if you lead to it from just a good engineering practice, you know what? There's all kinds of other. Once you start adopting that mindset, there's all kinds of other good maturity security things that as an organization that you also kind of do. So it leads to these other good behaviors, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, because once I know I have it, now I can set myself up to do something with it or about it and develop my other processes, such as keeping it up to date.
Yeah, absolutely. And, open source is like the ultimate supply chain, right? Organizations fork things and modify things, rename things, and redistribute those things. And sooner or later, the identity of what it was actually started with is may not necessarily be all that known. But the point is that, organizations, they take these components and they modify them. And if you're doing the whole SBOM thing, if you're describing that as part of your build cycle, now as a, if I'm mitigating we were talking about a library here and it's vulnerable. Well, now maybe I couldn't upgrade, but I could backport some patches, right? So now I can actually describe some of that stuff in my SBOM, which is also a good engineering practice, I think.
Yeah, and that gets tricky. I was just today started reading the Exim vulnerability, and Qualys researchers produced pages and pages of documentation about each of the 21 CVEs and descriptions of each. And in one of the descriptions, they were like, this bug was flagged as a bug, but it wasn't flagged as a security bug. Therefore, the Debian project didn't backport it as a security patch. And I'm like, wow, there is one of the challenges with open source and this bill of materials, because you run into issues like that all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Software bill of materials, I think it's going to solve a lot of, obviously transparency issues and whether or not things were backported or not. It has that capability today. I think as an industry, we kind of have to come to a reckoning where we have to be transparent with one another, because it's the only way we're going to be able to protect ourselves.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways that plays out. I mean, obviously a large open source project, you can see what's happening. But if I'm including these various components in my commercial product, I have to be the sole person that is responsible for that chain of software.
Hey, hey, Steve. I was gonna follow up with a real quick question for you. So, I've been in the AppSec space forever. I was at Veracode for a while. Sonatype. I've been at a number of different vendors. It used to be way back when I was younger, we wrote our own software, right? Then we switched to assembling components built by others. And I think somewhere in the future, it will be less assembling written components and more making calls to kind of, let's call it the SaaSification of libraries, or the SaaSification of components, right? i.e. external APIs that are run by others, maybe for money or whatever. Does Cyclone DX or SBOM take into account the use of APIs in kind of that model yet?
It does. It fully supports services, and I actually had a need to do that in my day job, where we were using a bunch of open source components for it was a mobile app actually, and one of our transient dependencies was making this API call, and we're like, okay, well, we're not making this call. Who's making this call? So we had to dig down to the source code to find out, and sure enough, this transient component was phoning home to something, and so that that kind of prompted me to add that to the Cyclone DX specification once we actually kind of ratified and kind of fleshed out what we wanted to do there. But I see the API use of a software as more of a serialization issue, right? It's instead of calling a function or a method, it's a function as a service. It's a remote procedure call. I really don't see any difference between the components running locally on a single machine, or running over the wire. I think they all should be captured.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think the vision, for at least that I have, is, if the future really does hold movement to service mesh, movement to micro-segmentation and microservices in general, all based on the back of cloud and cloud-native app development, it makes total sense to start to also categorize, collect, analyze, and protect the APIs that our software calls. Because really, at some point, that's going to be the future of where we make most of our calls. A great example of that is Google Maps. Like, nobody writes their own map software. Everybody just uses Google Maps and embeds it in their app. And that's a perfect example of why would you ever want to reinvent that wheel. So I do think that over time, SaaSification of libraries will turn everything into API-driven apps. That's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, I really hope it happens. I see, we've gone from, like you said, writing our own software to using third-party components to, as building blocks, to using frameworks. And I'm looking at like the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard, and there's like hundreds of things in there. And for every application, you have to get all these things right. Whether it's, properly hashing your passwords, or, your OIDC, how that's set up, or, cryptography, whatever. It's a lot of things to get wrong for every single application that you build. So, from a pure scalability perspective, I think the SaaSification of applications is going to have a really good impact on software security. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
I agree, because we just implemented, we're using Cognito, for example, and there's a lot of things you have to consider as a developer when you talk about authentication and authorization. And you can write all that code yourself, but I want to focus my developers on the business logic, not on reinventing the wheel. So we're going to use that service, but it's important to call that out in an SBOM, that you're using that service, and follow guidelines on how you use that service, and make sure that that's documented, because we're putting trust, in this case in Amazon, with the authentication process.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and play devil's advocate a little bit, that's a lot of trust out there. Like, I've seen some amazing applications, where just a few lines of code using these existing services, microservices and APIs and things like that. Like, you can put together quite a bit, with, a day's work. It's amazing what people build in some of these hackathons and things that I've seen inside companies and publicly. But yeah, each of those, you're trusting that they've done all those things right, that they've gotten the cryptography right, that they're not rolling their own, that they've, gotten all those, OWASP points correct. And I feel like that's another piece as well. Like how do you quickly do your due diligence there, before choosing to use that API?
It's a SBOM chaining, right? You need the SBOM for your app, and then the SBOM for all the components you're including and the components they're including, right?
It turns into a full software supply chain problem. I mean, if we just have the literally multi-billion-dollar market cap companies that are built on the SaaSification of APIs. Twilio started out as the ability to send SMSs through an API, right? And now they're a multi-billion-dollar company. And really what they are is they're being embedded into every other application that we make, because there's no other application being made right now that if you use SMS sending, you're not using anything else. And so it becomes the supply chain problem, where we used to have to, or currently have to, worry about using components from a third party, is now going to turn into, similar to our trust model for Amazon or from some other service provider, where it's like, okay, we have to trust but verify that that particular service provider, or in this case, Twilio's APIs, have been written in a secure manner. And so there's that transference of trust that we'll have to, again, kind of take another leap in the next few years.
Yeah, that's
a few years ago, a company reached out to me to take a look at ClickHouse because it was critical to one of their software products, and was founded and managed by Yandex, a Russian-owned company. It was making them a little bit nervous. And this was back in maybe 2017, 2018. And it was just never got the priority it needed to make it happen, and the guy couldn't get the funds allocated. And as far as I know, they still haven't done it. And they're still pretty dependent on this Russian owned and run open source project.
The challenge, I think, is going to be, we've got SBOM specifications like Cyclone DX that, handles not only your software, but your services as well. And for services, we can supply the endpoints, for example. We can supply the data classifications, right, and that sort of thing, and the direction of flow between what those classifications are. I think the harder part is going to be, through automation. How do we actually scour all of our source code and find all that information out, right? We can get the URLs. That's elementary, but what data is going over there, and how can we do that through automation? That might be a little challenging, and that's probably a good place for commercial interest to focus some efforts on.
Well, and Cyclone has to win to make that happen to some extent, right? It's only as useful as it's broadly used, and you have that XML data in the right format, right?
Yeah, and fortunately, we've been fairly successful in the adoption space. It's really interesting. When you look at the various formats, we've all kind of come from different perspectives, right? SWID has the software ID has come from more of the intellectual property and licensing perspective. If I have, X number of Adobe Photoshop installs in my organization, I can actually track that with SWID. SPDX has historically been more focused on open source licenses, and that's their strong suit. And Cyclone DX comes out of a lot of the work that I've been doing for OWASP. Cyclone DX is not an OWASP project itself, but it's come out of the work that I've been doing for OWASP. And fortunately, a lot of security companies and whatnot have been adopting it. One of the interesting things that I find with Cyclone and how my journey to SBOM has played out, coming from a more good engineering practice perspective rather than the transparency perspective, is that the overwhelming majority of organizations that are using some of these OWASP tools, that are using Cyclone DX, et cetera, they're actually doing so as kind of a SCA alternative, right? They've got hundreds or thousands of builds in their environment, and they've kind of adopted SBOMs as just the course of good engineering practices, but don't necessarily have any short-term plans of actually sharing those out yet. But in the event they do, they're going to be better positioned to meet any kind of regulatory, legal compliance requirements to do so.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to a question. I think a lot of people, when they think SBOMs, they have very specific use cases they think of. But the use cases here with SBOMs is very broad. Like, we've touched a lot on the vulnerability management use cases here. Understanding what you have so that, if a 0-day comes out for something, you can quickly identify it through an asset inventory and remediate it, do something with it to remove the risk there. But yeah, you mentioned a few things there, like checking commercial software and, looking for open source license compliance across your organization. So wondering if you could talk a bit more about some of the use cases that don't immediately come to people's mind when they think about how they can use an SBOM.
Yeah, no, that's great. So obviously, when we think of vulnerability, we might think of, like you said, the 0-day, but we can also think of it in terms of remediation, right? I'm using a vulnerable component, but I've actually made some backports. There's going to be a lot of cases where I might not be affected by something, right? So I might actually describe that, hey, I'm not actually impacted by this, and here's why in my SBOM. The remediation aspect is interesting because especially for components that maybe you can't upgrade because of incompatibilities, or maybe the project is no longer supported, you can create your own fixes, and you can describe what those fixes are, so that when you're communicating that out, you're saying, hey, I'm using this component. Yes, it's vulnerable, but I've actually made these fixes to remediate whatever issue there is. A third issue I think is interesting is just linking out to the security advisories themselves, right? So if I'm using X component, maybe it's a commercial component, open source, whatever, you can kind of link out to the more real-time advisories. So if you're using CSAF, for example, you can get that kind of feed from the SBOM. But there's all kinds of other cases too. Open source licensing is one where you can describe not only the license of the component itself, but maybe that component has other licenses in it. That component may not necessarily be licensed under those other things, but it has code that does have other licenses in it. So you can describe all of those things with SBOMs today. And of course, there is the commercial aspect to that as well. Working with the folks, the working groups over at the National Telecommunications and Infrastructure Administration, led by Alan Friedman. He says SBOM entirely too much, but but it's really interesting because I came from it from an engineering perspective, obviously, but he's came from it from a transparency and market failure perspective. And he's kind of really like opened my eyes on some of these other use cases that you really never crossed my mind. Incidents involving public safety, for example. If we need to investigate what software was in play, if an airline, God forbid, crashes, well, the SBOM can actually describe that. It can describe what software was in play, possibly how it was made, what modifications were made to it. That's really useful, right?
Like a snapshot that you can attach to the incident report, right?
Yeah. So there's all kinds of these other use cases that I find really, really interesting that working with the folks over at NTIA has kind of really opened my eyes to some stuff that I wasn't aware of.
I just, in closing, one thing I was thinking of recently with respects to open source licenses is the validation of license compliance and how we could potentially automate that. In other words, if I've included an open source component in my commercial software and the license dictates that if I've modified it, I have to share it back out, how do we automatically check that company's actually shared it back out? Like, is there a link or like a placeholder to go, like, here's where you put your GitHub repository, but like that's not a universal thing? How do we validate that?
That's a good point. I think there's a lot of work that can be done there. I think the SBOM formats, they can describe what the licenses are. They can link out to what the licenses are and the obligations. But in terms of actually checking the obligations, I don't know of anything that can automate that today. I was looking at the GitHub because they support the checks for licenses as well, and they only support like I think about 12 or so open source licenses where they actually break down what the obligations are. And 12 is okay, but there's 500 more. Or more like open source licenses.
Yeah,
I think
different
Sonatype has over 2,500. Yeah,
there are a lot of variations of them as well, right?
Yeah, we're gonna have to hire teams of lawyers to figure out what the obligations are.
Well, yeah, because it does get into some like really nitty gritty details in a lot of those licenses, for sure.
Yeah, in fact, I just pulled out of one of my projects. We actually just removed the Java library org.json. Its license basically was "do no evil." I'm like, okay,
yeah.
How do you interpret? How do you measure that?
Exactly. Well, awesome. Steve, are there places you'd like folks to visit to learn more about software bills of materials and how to create them and maintain them?
No, thank you. So cyclonedx.org, cyclone.dx.org. Version 1.3, just by coincidence, was released yesterday, and it's every year or so we've been pushing out yearly releases to the spec. We kind of follow this risk-based approach to standards development. We try to get as much value out to the community so they can start identifying and reducing risk as quickly as possible. So we have typically yearly releases for that. And 1.3 was just launched yesterday. We have a lot of examples and use cases on the website. We've got a tool center, for example, for a list of all the various commercial and open source tools to kind of get you started. And we have a pretty vibrant community on Slack as well. So all of that information is on the website.
Awesome.
Yeah, congrats to whoever designed this website, because it's really well put together. Like, you've got the guiding principles, the use cases you mentioned, the tool center where there's like 62 tools and you can filter based on different things, proprietary, open source. Like I feel like I understand this pretty well just looking at it while you've been talking in this last 30 minutes.
That was hopefully the goal. I'm glad I think I might have achieved that. We'll see. But SBOM, I think, really needs to be approachable, because as an abstract concept, it sounds really, really frightening. And the only way I think SBOM is going to be successful is if you make it easy and very, very approachable, which is what we're trying to do.
Outstanding. Steve, thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Appreciate it.
Stick around. Coming up next, Carlos Morales from News Star. Stay tuned.